This is LING 270, Language, Technology, and Society, Module 4, Printing. In this lesson, we'll talk about Gutenberg's printing press. So as we've covered so far in our lessons in this module, we see that printing has actually existed well before Gutenberg's time. So Gutenberg developed his printing press in the 1400s, but we see that printing inventions had existed long before that. So Gutenberg didn't really invent the concept of printing, but there was an invention which he did invent originally, and this is the process of typecasting. So keep an eye out for this in the lesson. We'll be talking about the process of typecasting. So in general, what the process of typecasting is the process of producing stamps used in movable type, specifically by a special metal alloy that Gutenberg had developed. And so Gutenberg had multiple motivations for developing his printing press, and these are things that we should be aware of when we're discussing his invention. One of which was the development of a printed Bible, the first of its kind. One of his most famous projects was the 42-line Bible. And also another major motivation for Gutenberg was the production of indulgences, a document which absolved a person of the sin by the Catholic Church in exchange for some money. And this was a process that became very corrupt, as we'll talk about a little bit later in this module. And we should also be aware of the context that Gutenberg had developed his press. So Gutenberg was a man of the Renaissance, and he lived in a climate where there was much more literature and much more writing and much more education going on. So demand for documents and demand for printing was something that was actually fairly high. And once Gutenberg had a major motivation, especially a financial motivation, to develop a technology like this. And once the printing press had been developed, the technology spread very rapidly across Europe because there was such a wide demand for it. So, so we'll cover these topics in this lesson today. We've covered in the past few lessons that printing technologies existed well before Gutenberg. And very often the technology of movable type is actually attributed to Gutenberg as well, although we actually see that movable type existed for even before him, and that it was just the process of typecasting that Gutenberg had made originally. So I should mention first that movable type is what we call when we make stamps for individual symbols of a language, rather than making a carving of an entire document when we're printing something. So as I mentioned, the technology of movable type actually was not invented by Gutenberg originally. We see that that older versions had been developed in China hundreds of years before. We can see that from talking about woodblock printing in China, that although it might have been very convenient for reproducing documents, it would have been very time consuming to actually produce that document. You would have had to carve out the indentations for the entire passage around every single character and brushstroke. To alleviate this problem, Bi Sheng developed a system of movable type around the year 1040 AD, so about 400 years before Gutenberg. And so this involved making separate ceramic stamps for each Chinese character. And then these characters could be moved and arranged to form new documents. So this is basically an example of movable type, well before the kinds that we saw in Europe. And later, Wang Zheng, in around the year 1300, so still 150 years before Gutenberg, developed a set of wooden blocks. So Bi Sheng's ceramic stamps were fairly fragile, but wooden blocks were much less fragile. They wouldn't break under the pressure of printing. That being said, the wooden blocks could get worn down over time after being repeatedly used. So that's something to be aware of too. And Wang Zheng also invented as kind of a side note, a revolving table for easy access of the types. So remember that Chinese has a very large number of characters, and therefore to make movable type system for this, you would have to carve out thousands of types. So being able to access them easily required a technology for easy organization. So these revolving tables were developed for that purpose. So yeah, let's move on to Gutenberg and his invention. Now, so let's talk about a little bit about the background of Gutenberg. So he was born around the year 1400 in Western Germany. He came from a wealthy family, which was fairly close to the Catholic Church. He lived in the city of Mainz, which is a major wine producing region, and it's suspected that the resemblance of the printing press to a wine press that may have been an inspiration for Gutenberg to develop the mechanism which actually gives the force for the printing. And Gutenberg was not a individual who was of writing. He was not a scribe. He wasn't a printer. He wasn't an intellectual, really. He was actually a goldsmith. So he, by profession, was someone who dealt with precious metals. So he was a working man, but he was but a goldsmith was someone who would have very high status in European society at this time period. So it's important to note that he was actually a goldsmith by trade. And we don't really know how Gutenberg actually developed his printing press. Very little records were kept about the actual process. So it's kind of hard to find out where exactly inspirations may have come from. And it's likely that there is little record because Gutenberg wanted to keep this invention a secret. So as I mentioned, there was a very high demand for printing at the time, and the printing process of indulgences, which produced revenue for the Catholic Church, made the printing a potentially very lucrative technology. So it's likely that Gutenberg may have kept little record intentionally to keep the technology secretive and to ensure that he would make the profits from printing rather than from someone else. So this is something to consider. Gutenberg, but what we do know is that Gutenberg began work on the press in 1436, and he was aided by a small number of people, namely by a gem cutter and the owner of a paper mill. And he was financed by another goldsmith named Johann Fust, who we'll come back to a little bit later. He's important in this process as well. By around the year 1450, the printing press was ready, and it had produced some of the first printing projects. Among these were the 42-line Bible. So this was the first mass-produced Bible and the first printed version of the Bible, so named because it was printed in 42 lines in 2 columns on each page in a way that's very reminiscent of the way that the scribes had done it in the Middle Ages previously. And indulgences were also an important product of the printing press, and this is something we'll be coming back to later. So I'll talk a little bit more about Gutenberg's key innovations in the printing press as well. So chief among them is the process of actually making types, which is called typecasting. So typecasting is the process by which a large number of these types can actually be produced, where a type is the name we give to the stamp for a single letter used in print. So the figure you see on the left here, that's an example of a type. So when we were talking about the Chinese movable type, you might have considered that although it might be a lot less work compared to carving out an entire document, it would still take a long time to carve out each shape of the thousands of Chinese characters that you would need to do. And this is tedious for a document written in the Latin alphabet as well. You would have to hand carve every single letter that you would need to arrange into a stamp in the document. So this is something that is very tedious. And another problem, at least compared to the movable type used in China, is that the Chinese movable type were made of wood and ceramic, which are materials which are less durable and they can break or wear down over time. But what Gutenberg used is he used his knowledge of, as a goldsmith, to make a special metal alloy made of lead, tin, and antimony, which is fairly durable, but has a low melting point, which makes it fairly easy to work with. So it could be melted down, made soft, and then poured into a mold to produce types, and then a large number of types could be produced fairly easily, but which were nonetheless very durable. Another benefit of mass producing types in this way is that it makes the types uniform. So all the it allows you to make many types which actually look very similar to each other. And using the alloy that as I mentioned, makes this very durable, and it can withstand a large amount of force and doesn't wear down over time. So here's how the process of typecasting actually works. So first, a master copy of the type is created by hand. So it still does require a little bit of handwork, but as we'll see, the amount of handwork is decreased significantly. So we call this initial copy the punch. So this is a handmade stamp of a single particular letter. So then we take this punch and hammer it into a matrix. So a matrix is a piece of metal. Gutenberg had used copper, which will have the indentation of that letter. So that punch would be hammered into the matrix several times to produce multiple identical copies of the image produced by the punch. So we have multiple indentations of the letter H, as we see in the figure on the right here. And then finally, at the end of the process, you pour molten metal over onto this matrix, and then the molten metal will fill into the indentations produced by the punch. And then once you break the metal into pieces, you have many different pieces of types, all of which are very close replicas of the original punch. So you have all these little stamps which all look very similar to each other and make a very uniform looking text. So here's an example of what a matrix might look like. They are a durable kind of metal which has been hammered in, and they are now in a position where they can be used to reproduce a kind of type over and over again. And now movable, the process of typecasting wasn't the only thing that Gutenberg had developed as well. Another thing that he really he developed was an oil-based ink. Now remember when we were talking about writing media that using vellum is a very expensive writing material. It's because it's from animal skins, while paper is much cheaper. Now, however, vellum is much more durable than paper, and you can really use water-based inks as well on paper. So too much water-based ink will soak the paper and cause it to break apart fairly easily. However, if you use an oil-based ink instead of a water-based ink, which contains mineral dyes in them, it can work on paper very well. This makes it possible to use paper as your printing material rather than vellum, and it greatly reduces the cost of your printing as well. So this was an important advancement as well. So this actually enabled the process of mass printing. So once you've cast all these types, once you've made all these little pieces, you can organize them into a box like you see here. And then when you want to actually produce a document, you take the types and arrange them into a written passage. As a result, you get a stamp of a document, which you can then use for printing. So the process of taking these types and putting them into a document is called typesetting. So this is a picture demonstrating typesetting. So in the set of lesson videos for this module, we have a video showing talking about the printing press in the same way. As so from the timestamp you see here from about 30 to 35 minutes, you actually see the process of typecasting to show you how that kind of works and how well it can reproduce a copy of the original. So if you want to look at, see that, you can look at this video here. And I also have another video showing the process of actually printing a document with Gutenberg's printing press. So I'll recap the process right here in this slide. So first, once you've completed your typesetting, you've put all your types into place for the document, you put the types on a table facing up. So, so the paper is actually above the type and it gets pressed onto the top of it. So then ink is applied to the types using a kind of leather mallet. So there is a leather hammer that is beat onto which is covered with ink and then beat onto the types so that they're nice and well covered with ink. Yeah. And these kind of mallets are used to apply the ink more evenly. Then the paper is mounted on a screen, which then folds down onto the type such that it touches the types. And then the table with the types is moved under the actual press, and the press is pulled down, pressing the paper into the types. So it's important that this force is actually added to give a really good printing of this text. And then finally, the paper is removed with the printed text. So you can watch a video showing how this process actually occurs. So as I mentioned, one of Gutenberg's key motivations and key developments was the mass production of a Bible called the 42-line Bible. This was his first major printing run. He made about 180 copies of the Bible, which might seem very small, especially by modern standards, but consider that just producing one copy of the Bible took about a year for scribes previously. So this was a massive advancement compared to the previous technology. And Gutenberg made 25% of them out of the original and traditional vellum material, but 75% of them were made with paper. So because of that, he was able to make them at a much reduced cost. So yeah. The Bible was written in Latin, as it was very commonly in the Middle Ages at the time, and it contained the Old and New Testaments. And it first achieved its notoriety at the Frankfurt Book Fair in 1454, which is a fair which still exists to this day. But this was where the technology of printing really gained notoriety, and people began talking about the process of printing. The future Pope Pius II remarked that had actually observed this Bible and had noticed that it could be read very easily without glasses. So this kind of goes to show that the quality of the print was very sharp and easy to read, and also it was fairly large. You didn't have to make it so small because you were trying to use your vellum as much as possible. It was printing which made it much easier to write. So here we see that when the technology of printing really became fairly notorious. Now, once the press had achieved some more attention, there became much more competition for the actual ownership of the press. As I discussed earlier, the press was a very lucrative operation and could earn quite a bit of money because of the value of what was being produced at the time. Remember I had mentioned that Johann Fust, a goldsmith, had made a loan to Gutenberg to develop the press, which would have been worth roughly $275 in today's money. Apparently Gutenberg had been delinquent on his payments, and Fust made a lawsuit against Gutenberg. And he won that lawsuit, and as a result, he won control of the printing press. But Gutenberg wasn't really fazed by this. He just went on to start a new press of his own. However, this legal arbitration had spread the knowledge of the printing press. So in the legal dispute, we found out what this technology was and how it was able to produce these documents so widely. So now the secret was out, and people knew how a printing press is actually designed and how they could make their own to sell their own printing and print their own documents if they want to. So we see very after this had happened that printing had spread very rapidly throughout Europe. So here's a graph showing the amount of printed documents, which we see has had a pretty astronomical increase in just a few hundred years after Gutenberg had developed his printing press. By 1480, printing presses were already widespread in Europe, not just in Germany. And by 1500, there were 270 European cities which had a printing press in them. So this is really a remarkable explosion just in the span of 50 years. And one of the cities which became most famous for printing was Venice. And by the year 1500, only 50 years after its development, there had been 20 million volumes that had been printed with this new invention of the printing press. And only 100 years after that, it increased tenfold. There were 200 million documents printed. So this rapid rise really demonstrates how much of a demand there was in Europe for printed materials. And so once the technology had been developed, it caught on very quickly. And here's another map kind of demonstrating how this actually, how the printing press had spread. So each of these dots on this map of Europe here shows where a printing press existed and how many volumes that it had produced. So we see that printing presses weren't only common in Germany, but they were also very widespread, especially in northern Italy and France, Spain, Britain, Scandinavia, and Eastern Europe as well. So we see that it had spread very quickly, even only 50 years after it had been developed. So now we're at a state where the printing press is very widespread in Europe, and we'll start to see the profound societal impact that printing had on society. Yeah, we'll be talking about that in the next couple of lessons.